On a Friday afternoon in September of 1994, a man named Gene Portis walked into the Midwest Farm Auction Company's office in Ames, Iowa, and set a manila folder on the counter. Inside the folder was a photograph, a 1948 Farmall M, taken in a barn. The tractor was red, or had been red, once, decades ago. Now it was the color of a fire that had been ashed over and left for years. Rust on the hood, rust on the fenders, rust on the wheel weights and the drawbar and the cultivator mounts that still hung from the rock shaft. The front tires were flat. The exhaust stack had a bird nest in it. The photograph looked like everything the Midwest Farm Auction Company saw every week. The auction appraiser's name was Dale Weston. He had been appraising farm equipment for 19 years and had developed the particular efficiency of a man who has seen enough of something that he can tell you its value before he finishes looking at it. He glanced at the photograph. Then he looked at Gene Portis. "What are you hoping to get for it?" Gene said. "I don't know what it's worth. That's why I'm here." Dale looked at the photograph again. 19 years told him what it was worth. He said, "We could list it in the November equipment auction. Lot it with some other vintage iron. Maybe get you $300–400 if the right buyer shows up." He paused. "More likely it goes as scrap. $200, maybe $150 if the market is soft." Gene said, "It runs." Dale looked at him. "The Farmall runs. I ran it this morning." Dale looked at the photograph again. He had appraised a lot of tractors that people said ran, and a lot of those tractors had not in fact run in any meaningful sense of the word. He said, "That changes things a little. Maybe 500 if it runs and runs well. But honestly, that's a 1948 M. There's a lot of them around. The collector market for common models is softer than people think." Gene said, "All right." Dale said, "You want to list it?" Gene said, "I'll think about it." He picked up his photograph and walked out. In his truck, he sat for a moment. He was 62 years old and had been farming the same 160 acres outside Boone his entire adult life. The Farmall M had belonged to his father. His father had bought it for the implement dealer in Ames in 1948, the year Gene was born. They had the same birthday, Gene and the tractor, February 14th. His father had said that made them brothers. Gene had not told Dale Weston that. He had not told Dale Weston anything except that the tractor ran and that he was thinking about selling it. He had not told him about the Valentine's Day birthday or the brother remark or the 46 years the tractor had been in the family. He had also not told Dale Weston what he knew about the tractor that Dale Weston did not know. He drove home and called a man named Robert Calhoun in Decatur, Illinois. Let me tell you about Gene Portis before we go any further, because the decision he made after leaving Dale Weston's office is the center of this story, and it only makes sense in the context of who Gene was and what he knew. Gene was the son of Earl Portis, who had been one of those farmers who treated his equipment with a specificity of care that other farmers found unusual, and that Gene had absorbed so completely as a child that he no longer recognized it as unusual. Earl changed the oil on schedule. He greased every fitting on every grease schedule without waiting until something started squawking for attention. He kept every service record in a brown envelope in the junk drawer in the kitchen, noting the date and the work and the hours on the meter. He washed the tractor twice a year, spring and fall, pressure washed the undercarriage, hand washed the sheet metal, touched up paint chips with a brush and a can he kept on the workshop shelf. Gene had watched this his entire childhood and had absorbed it the way children absorb the things their parents do consistently, not as lessons but as the way things were done. Earl had one more habit that Gene had also absorbed. He read, not farm magazines, though he read those too. He read whatever he could find about the equipment he owned. Service, manuals, repair bulletins, the technical publications that International Harvester sent to dealers and that occasionally found their way to farmers through the implement dealer in Ames. Earl believed that owning a machine obligated you to understand it, not just how to operate it, how it worked. Why was it built the way it was built? What the engineers had intended when they made the decisions they made. This was unusual. Most farmers, Gene knew, treated their equipment as tools with inputs and outputs, not as objects with histories and engineering rationale. They knew what the tractor did. They did not particularly care why it did it or what decisions had gone into making it do it that way. Earl cared. He had a shelf in the workshop with 12 years of service manuals, parts books, and repair bulletins for every piece of equipment on the farm. He had a correspondence file with letters he had written to International Harvester's Service Department asking technical questions and the written responses he had received. He had, in Gene's memory, once driven to a dealer 2 counties over specifically to look at a cutaway display model that showed the internal mechanism of the magneto on the M because he wanted to understand how the timing advance worked. Gene had inherited the shelf and the correspondence file. He had added to both over the years. He was not as deeply curious as his father had been, but the habit of reading what was available about the things he owned had stayed with him. Which was why when the back issue of the Antique Power Collector's newsletter arrived in his mailbox in 1991, forwarded from a previous subscriber, Gene read it instead of throwing it away. When Earl died in 1981, Gene had kept the Farmall running, had continued every service interval, had kept the envelope of service records, adding his own entries in his own handwriting below his father's. The tractor had 6,200 hours on it when Earl died and had 90,800 hours on it by the fall of 1994. What Dale Weston had seen in the photograph was the exterior, which was honest. The Farmall looked like what it was, a 46-year-old machine that had worked for 46 years in Iowa weather. The rust was real, the flat tires were real, the bird nest in the exhaust stack was real. What Dale Weston had not seen was the interior. The engine that Earl had rebuilt in 1962 at 3,100 hours, correctly, with the right parts to the correct tolerances, documented in the brown envelope. The magneto that Gene had rebuilt in 1988, himself, following the service manual his father had kept. The carburetor that had been rebuilt twice, each time with correct OEM parts, each time documented. And one more thing that Dale Weston could not have seen in a photograph, and that Gene had not mentioned, the serial number. Let me tell you about Farmall M serial numbers, because this is where the story turns from a tractor story into something else. International Harvester built the Farmall M from 1939 to 1952. Over the course of those 13 years, they built hundreds of thousands of them. The Farmall M was by every measure a common tractor. Plentiful, widespread, available in every farm county in the country. When Dale Weston said there were a lot of them around, he was not wrong. But the Farmall M had a production history that most people, including most auction appraisers, did not know in detail. International Harvester had introduced significant mechanical changes to the M at specific points in its production run. The late models, the 1951 and 1952 builds, had updates that made them more capable and more desirable to collectors. The very early models, the 1939 and 1940 builds, had original features that the later changes had removed, features that the collectors who cared about originality cared about deeply. Gene's tractor was a 1948, middle of the run, nothing special there. Except that Gene's tractor had a serial number that fell within a range that Robert Calhoun, who had been studying Farmall M production records for 22 years and who had written a privately circulated reference guide that the serious M collectors used, had identified as significant. In 1948, International Harvester had made a small experimental production run of approximately 200 Farmall M tractors fitted with a cylinder head casting that had been redesigned for improved cooling. The redesign had worked but had added cost to the casting process, and IH had reverted to the standard casting for the remainder of the 1948 production year. The experimental head castings were gone from the line within 6 months. The 200 tractors that had received them were scattered across the country with no external identification, indistinguishable from any other 1948 M unless you pulled the head and compared casting numbers. Gene's tractor, according to Robert Calhoun's reference guide, had a serial number in the range of the experimental production run. Gene had found this out 3 years earlier, reading through a back issue of an antique tractor collector's newsletter that had arrived unsolicited in his mailbox, forwarded from a previous subscriber. He had read the article about the experimental head castings, looked up the serial number range, gone to the barn, and checked his tractor's number. He had not pulled the head to confirm. He had called Robert Calhoun instead, described the serial number, and listened to Robert Calhoun become very quiet on the other end of the line. Robert Calhoun answered on the second ring. Gene said, "I went to the auction house today." Robert said, "What did they say?" Gene said, $300 to $500, probably scrap value. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gene, I've been thinking about this since we talked in August. I want to make you an offer directly, before you put it in any auction." Gene said, "I'm listening." Robert said, "I've been in contact with the Farmall M Collectors Association. I sent them the information about your serial number and the service history and the rebuild records. There are 11 members who have asked me to let them know if you decide to sell. 11 people who collect M tractors seriously and who have been looking for an example from this production range for years." Gene said, "What are they expecting to pay?" Robert said, "That depends on whether the head casting confirms the experimental run. If it does, the collectors I've talked to are expecting this to be a significant find. The most serious collector I've spoken with has indicated he would pay over $20,000 for a confirmed example in running condition with documented service history." Gene was quiet. Robert said, "There may be others who would go higher once word gets out. The M collector community is connected. When something significant comes available, people hear about it." Gene said, "How many people are in that community?" Robert said, "Serious collectors? A few hundred nationally. People who track production history and pay real money for significant examples, maybe 60 or 70. Gene said, "And how many of them know about my tractor?" Robert said, 11 right now. "But Gene, if you list this at Midwest Farm Auction as scrap iron, and word gets out afterward about what it was, those collectors are going to be very unhappy. Not with you, with the process that let a significant piece of history go for $150. Gene looked out his kitchen window at the barn where the tractor had sat for 46 years. He said, "Robert, what would you suggest?" Robert said, "Let me make some calls. I'd like to organize a proper sale, not an auction house that handles commodity equipment. A sale that reaches the right buyers, the people who know what this tractor might be." Gene said, "How long would that take?" Robert said, "I can have interested parties notified within a week. I can arrange for them to come see the tractor within 2 weeks. If you're willing to let me pull the head and confirm the casting, we'll know what we actually have before any money changes hands." Gene said, "Pull the head." Robert said, "I'll be there Saturday." Robert Calhoun arrived Saturday morning in a pickup truck, with a toolbox in the bed and a camera around his neck. He was 58 years old, had the careful hands of someone who worked with old metal regularly, and had the specific focus of a man who has been waiting for something for a long time and is now very close to finding out whether it is what he hoped. They went to the barn together. Gene started the tractor for Robert, let it warm up, shut it down. Robert listened to the engine with the particular attention of someone who hears things in an engine's sound that most people don't hear. He said nothing while it ran. He made one small sound when it shut down that Gene took to be positive. Then they pulled the head. It took 3 hours. The head bolts on a 46-year-old engine do not always cooperate, and these require patience and penetrating oil and the kind of careful persuasion that comes from experience with old iron. Robert did most of the work. Gene handed tools and held lights and watched Robert's face. When the head came free and Robert turned it over and looked at the casting number on the underside, his expression changed. He said, "There it is." Gene said, "Is it the right number?" Robert set the head down carefully on a clean cloth he had spread on the workbench. He took a photograph, then another. He took out a small notebook and compared the casting number to a series of numbers he had written there. He said, "Gene, this is one of them." Gene leaned against the workbench. He had been almost certain. He had been certain enough to not sell the tractor at the auction house. But hearing it confirmed was different from being almost certain. He said, "How many confirmed examples are there now?" Robert said, "With this one, 3. There are 3 confirmed examples of the 1948 experimental head casting in the entire country. 2 are in collections. Both are non-running, partially disassembled, missing significant components. Neither has service documentation." He looked at the tractor, at the clean engine that Jean's father had rebuilt in 1962 and that had been running every spring since. He said, "This is the only confirmed running example, with full service history, with original sheet metal." He paused. "Jean, this is the best one." Robert Calhoun sent 63 letters the following week. Not emails, letters typed on a manual typewriter he had owned since 1971, mailed first class to 63 members of the Farmall M Collectors Association and related networks who he judged to be serious enough to be interested, financially capable of making a significant purchase, and geographically positioned to travel to Boone, Iowa. The letter was 1 page. It described the tractor, the serial number, the confirmed casting, the service history, the engine rebuild documentation, and the current running condition. It included 2 photographs. It stated that the owner was willing to allow inspection on a specific Saturday 2 weeks hence, and that any interested party was welcome to come. It did not state a price. Robert had advised Jean that for something of this nature, the price should emerge from the market rather than be set in advance. 41 of the 63 letters produced confirmations, 41 collectors who said they would be there. The other 22 didn't respond in time. 22 of them showed up anyway. 63 people came to Jean Portis's farm on a Saturday morning in October of 1994. Jean had not expected 63 people. He had expected perhaps 20, perhaps 30. He had set up the barn the evening before, moved equipment to create space, set out folding chairs against the walls, and made sure the tractor was accessible from all sides. He had also spent an hour cleaning the tractor that evening, not restoring it, not touching up paint or addressing the rust. Just cleaning it, the way his father had cleaned it twice a year, removing the accumulated grime of the season so that the people who came could see what they were looking at clearly. The rust was honest. The wear was honest. Jean did not want to hide any of it. He wanted to show what 46 years of working life looked like on a machine that had been maintained as carefully as this one had. He washed the engine compartment with solvent and wiped it down. He cleaned the instruments on the dash. He polished the nameplate on the side of the hood, the one that said Farmall M in red letters on a silver background. He replaced the flat front tires with a pair he had kept in the workshop, not original but correct for the era. He did not replace the rear tires, which were the originals, cracked and worn but still holding pressure, still carrying the cast date codes that confirmed they had been on this tractor for decades. He left the bird nest in the exhaust stack. He had thought about removing it, but the nest was part of the truth of the tractor, and the people who were coming understood the truth of old machines better than they understood restoration projects designed to look better than they were. The first truck arrived at 7:15 in the morning. The driver was a man from Minnesota who had driven 6 hours overnight to be there early. He shook Jean's hand, introduced himself as Paul Enger, and asked if he could look at the tractor before the others arrived. Jean said yes. Paul spent 45 minutes with the tractor. He moved around it slowly, crouching to look under the frame, standing on the drawbar to see down into the engine compartment from above, lying flat on the concrete to look at the undercarriage. He made no notes. He asked no questions. He simply looked, with the concentrated attention of a man who has spent 30 years learning to see old machines and who is now looking at something he has been thinking about for a long time. When the second truck arrived, Paul straightened up and stepped back. He had the expression of a man who has confirmed something he suspected but is not yet ready to say out loud. He said to Jean quietly, "Where did your father buy this?" Jean said, "Thayer Implements in Ames, February 1948. Paul said, "Did he deal with the same salesman the whole time?" Jean said, "A man named Harold Burke. Worked there 22 years. My father drove into town every time he needed anything just to deal with Harold specifically." Paul looked at the tractor. Then he said, "Good." Jean said, "Why does that matter?" Paul said, Because the experimental head castings went to specific dealers in a limited geographic area, Thayer Implement was on the list. It confirms the distribution record. He looked at Gene. I'll want to see the head casting before I make any offer, but I'll tell you now, if the casting confirms, this is what I think it is. Gene said Robert Calhoun confirmed it last Saturday. Paul was quiet. Then he said, I know. Robert called me. That's why I drove 6 hours last night. By 9 o'clock there were 31 people in the barn. By 9:30 there were 47. By 10 o'clock, when Robert Calhoun called the gathering to order, 63 people were standing in a barn in Boone County, Iowa, looking at a 1948 Farmall M that an auction appraiser had valued at scrap. Robert stood at the front of the group beside the tractor and explained what they were looking at. The serial number, the casting confirmation, the service history that Gene's father had started and Gene had continued. The engine rebuild was documented in the brown envelope that Gene had brought from the kitchen junk drawer, and that was now circulating through the crowd, each person reading the entries in Earl's handwriting and then Gene's. When Robert finished, the barn was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that collects in a space when 63 people are all thinking about the same thing. Then someone toward the back said, Can you start it? Gene climbed onto the seat. He had sat on this seat his entire life, from the first time his father had let him ride along as a small child to the most recent spring planting. The seat was worn to the shape of a farmer, smooth where hands and weight had smoothed it over 46 years. He set the choke. He set the throttle. He engaged the starter. The 1948 Farmall M, with its experimental head casting and its rebuilt engine and its 9,800 documented hours and its 46 years of February birthdays and its brown envelope of service records, started on the first crank. The engine settled into the idle that Gene had heard 10,000 times in his life. Even, steady. The sound of something built right and kept right running, because that was what things built right and kept right did. Nobody in the barn said anything for a moment. Then the man from Minnesota, who had been first to arrive and had spent 45 minutes alone with the tractor before anyone else came, said, quietly, I'll give you $28,000. Gene did not sell that morning. Robert had advised him not to sell at the inspection, to let the collectors go home and consider, to allow the seriousness of what they had seen settle into the understanding that there was only one of these and that the one was here. It was good advice. After the tractor started and ran for 15 minutes and Gene shut it down, the barn went into a different kind of conversation. Not the formal presentation that Robert had given, but the informal discussion that happens among people who share a serious interest and have just seen something that changes the boundaries of what they thought existed in the world. Gene stood to the side and listened. He understood perhaps a third of what was being said. The technical discussions about casting metallurgy and head design and cooling efficiency exceeded what he knew about the engineering, but he understood the human part of it clearly enough. These were people who had studied a specific subject deeply, who had established through years of research what was known and what was unknown and what was likely gone forever, and who were now standing in front of evidence that something they had believed was likely gone forever was in fact here, in running condition, in a barn in Iowa. Paul Enger from Minnesota found Gene at the edge of the group around mid-morning and said, I want to ask you something personal, if that's acceptable. Gene said, Go ahead. Paul said, Did you know what this was when you went to the auction house? Gene said, I knew it might be something. I didn't know what the auction house would say. Paul said, But you already knew about the serial number range. You'd already talked to Robert. Gene said, Yes. Paul said, So you went to the auction house knowing they were likely to undervalue it? Gene considered the question carefully. He said, I went to the auction house to find out what someone who didn't know would say about it. Not because I wanted their appraisal, because I wanted to confirm that the knowledge gap was real. That the difference between what it was and what it looked like was as large as I thought it was. Paul looked at him. Gene said, My father always said that the most important thing about any machine was not what it could do but what you knew about it. Knowledge was the difference between a tool and a resource, between something you used up and something you invested in. He kept the service records because the service records were part of the machine. They were the proof of what it was. Paul said the auction house didn't see the service records. Jean said no. They saw the photograph. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The photograph looked like scrap." Jean said the photograph was honest. It looked exactly like what it was on the outside. You just had to know that what was on the outside wasn't the whole story. Paul looked at the tractor, at the rust in the worn seat and the bird nest still in the exhaust stack and the cracked original rear tires with their cast date codes. He said, "I'll have an offer for you by the end of the week." Jean said, "I appreciate that." The offers that came in over the following 3 weeks started at $28,000 and went higher. They came by telephone and by letter, and in 2 cases by collectors who drove back to Boone unannounced because they had thought about nothing else since the Saturday in October and wanted to look at the tractor one more time. One of those collectors, a man from Indiana who had driven back on a Thursday morning without calling ahead, stood in the barn for a long time after Jean had opened it for him. He said, almost to himself, "I've been looking for a running example for 11 years. He looked at Jean. "Did you know that when you went to the auction house?" Jean said, "I knew there weren't many." The man from Indiana said, "There's one other confirmed example in running condition, or there was. The owner died in 1989 and the estate sold it to someone who disassembled it for parts without knowing what it was." He paused. "So this is it. There's no other one." Jean was quiet. The man from Indiana said the auction house was going to list it for scrap. Jean said, "That's what they told me." The man from Indiana shook his head. He did not say anything else. He stood with the tractor for another 20 minutes and then drove back to Indiana. His offer came in the mail 4 days later. It was $38,000. Frank Delacourt's offer, which arrived by telephone the following week, was $41,000. Jean sold the tractor in November to a collector from Ohio named Frank Delacourt, who had a collection of significant Farmall examples and who had the resources and the intention to preserve the M in running condition for the long term. The sale price was $41,000. Jean had not told Dale Weston any of this when he picked up his photograph and walked out of the auction house 6 weeks earlier. He had not needed to. Dale Weston had told Jean everything Jean needed to know. $300 to $500, probably scrap. That was the price of not knowing what you were looking at. $41,000 was the price of knowing. Let me tell you about the conversation Jean had with Dale Weston after the sale. Because Jean did have that conversation in December of 1994, and it is the part of this story that says something true about the difference between price and value and between the knowledge that determines one and the knowledge that determines the other. Jean drove to the Midwest Farm Auction Company's office in Ames on a Tuesday morning. He walked in and found Dale Weston at the counter, same as before. Dale looked at him. "You come back to list that Farmall?" Jean said, "I sold it privately." Dale said, "How much did you get?" Jean said, $41,000. The counter was very quiet. Dale looked at Jean for a long moment. He said, 41. Jean said, "Yes." Dale said, "For a 1948 M." Jean said, "For a 1948 M, with a confirmed experimental head casting from a limited production run of approximately 200 tractors, of which 3 examples are confirmed. The only confirmed running example with full documented service history." Dale was quiet. Jean said, "I don't tell you this to embarrass you. I tell you because someone is going to walk through that door someday with a photograph of something that looks like what you expect it to look like, and it will be something else entirely. And if you don't know the difference, you'll tell them to list it for scrap value and they'll walk out of here and find someone who does know the difference." Dale said, "How did you know?" Jean said, "I read. There's a newsletter. There's a reference guide. There are people who have spent decades studying these machines and who will tell you what they're worth if you know to ask them." Dale said, "I've been doing this for 20 years. Jean said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you. 20 years of seeing what a thing looks like is not the same as knowing what a thing is. Those are different kinds of knowledge. He shook Dale's hand. Then he drove home. The barn was empty now, without the tractor. It was the first time in 46 years that the barn had been without it, and the absence was a specific kind of quiet that Gene had expected to feel worse than it did. He stood in the empty space for a while. He thought about his father buying the tractor new in 1948, the year Gene was born. He thought about the Valentine's Day birthday, the brother remark, the envelope of service records that now sat in Frank Delacourt's collection in Ohio alongside the tractor it described. He thought about Dale Weston saying scrap value and Robert Calhoun saying this is the best one. Same tractor, two different kinds of knowledge, $40,000 between them. The Farmall M is still in Frank Delacourt's collection. He has kept his word about maintaining it in running condition. It appears at 1 or 2 shows each year, started by Frank or by his son who has learned how. The service envelope that Earl Portis started in 1948 and Gene Portis continued through 1994 is in a frame on the wall of Frank's restoration shop, beside the tractor that it describes. The casting number is still in Robert Calhoun's reference guide, updated now to note confirmed status and current owner and the fact that this is the only confirmed running example in existence. 3 examples confirmed, 2 in collections, disassembled, incomplete, 1 running, documented, whole. The one that an auction appraiser called scrap on a Friday afternoon in September of 1994, and that 63 collectors drove from 6 states to see the following month, and that sold for $41,000 in November, and that has been running at shows in Ohio for 30 years since. That one, the one Gene Portis's father bought on February 14, 1948, the one Earl called Gene's brother because they shared a birthday, the one that a man who didn't know what he was looking at told Gene to list as scrap, the one that 63 people who knew exactly what they were looking at showed up to see at 7:15 on a Saturday morning in October because they had been waiting for it their whole collecting lives. That one is still running, same as it always was.